So back in the project we worked on before, a bit simplified, I dumped the event modifiers, I dumped v1s, and you find this snapshot attached to this lecture in case you also want to start from, well, this state again. So I'm back in this project where we have this input element and the buttons for the counter and so on. Now let's say our goal is to have another button, maybe here below the input, where we say reset input. And the button should do what the name implies. It should reset the input in, well, the input element. For that, we can add a new method, reset input, or however you want to name it. And in there, how do we do that? In there, we now want to clear this input. Now, we could try to get access to the input through JavaScript with document query selector, for example, get access to the input like this, access the value property and set it to an empty string. This might actually work, but it's very hacky. We're not using Vue to then fall back to such explicit JavaScript instructions. That's not the idea behind using Vue. Instead, we want to stay in the Vue world and leverage Vue and its features for that. So, how could we do that? Well, we could use the name data property, which is the value we're ultimately updating on every keystroke, and output it here in input by setting value, the value attribute, equal to name, however, not like this, but instead, since name is dynamic and managed by Vue, with help of vbind. With that, I'm making sure that name is reflected here, so this name here is reflected in the input. Why am I doing that? Well, if I now go to reset input and set this name equal to an empty string, that empty value should be reflected in the input, and we should be able to set it back to an empty string. Now we'll have one problem with that, and that is that in setName, I'm not setting name to just what the user enters, but to what the user enters plus the last name, and that would lead to a strange behavior if we then reflect name back into this input here. I can actually show it to you. If I reload, you'll see if I start typing, Schwarzmuller gets added over and over again, which is not the idea. So for the moment, let's get rid of this last name, which we add here, and let's just store what the user enters with every keystroke in name, and then reflect name back into the input, so that there we really reflect what the user entered. And now let's also connect this button here with vOnClick to this newly added reset input method, so that this is triggered when the reset input button is pressed. And with that, if I now reload, I can enter max here, and it all works, but if I click reset input, we clear that. We also clear it in the paragraph, because there we're referring to the same name which we reset here, but that's just a little side effect here. Of course, if we wanted to prevent that, we could use a separate value which we output here, which we confirm upon hitting enter or anything like that. I showed this before, how we could work with two values, a confirmed input and a regular input, but that's not what this is about. Instead, what this is about the fact that this is a pattern you could need in some occasions. You might have inputs where you don't just want to get the value the user entered, but where you also want to set the value of the input so that you, for example, can reset it with a button or any other logic you have on your page. And you can then achieve this by not just listening to the input, but by also sending the stored value back into the input by binding the value property. This is a common pattern you could need. And actually, it's so common that you need something like this that Vue has a shortcut for this, you could say. It has a special built-in directive which simplifies this. If you bind the value and listen to input changes on input, you can get rid of all of that So both of the value binding and the input event listening, get rid of both, and instead add a new directive on the input, the vModel directive. And this vModel directive now simply wants the data property it should manage for you. So in our case, the name property. The name property now is managed by Vue such that it's updated on the input event, and the name property's value is then sent back into the input element. So vModel is simply just a shortcut for vBind value and vOnInput. vModel is just a shortcut for this. And if I now save that and reload, we therefore get the same behavior as before, but with less code. And this is a concept called two-way binding, because we're communicating in both ways. We are listening to an event coming out of the input element, you could say, to the input event. And at the same time, we're writing the value back to the input element through its value attribute, through its value property. That's why it's called two-way binding, because we communicate in both directions. And this is useful. It makes getting user input and updating it much easier, as you can tell. It's less code and therefore absolutely a pattern and specifically a directive you should keep in mind.